What's up, guys? Tim Little. Welcome back to Tactical Bass. In today's video, we are talking early springtime fishing, where these fish go, and how you can catch them. It is time to start getting, if you're not already, to start getting excited for the upcoming fishing season. It is now kind of that transition, or at least we're hoping, fingers crossed, but starting to think about that spring transition. Warmer weather, warmer water, more active bass. Now is the time to get excited. At least I am. You know, I was fortunate enough to be down in Florida last week, and it really got me thinking about springtime. You know, we're talking shorts, t-shirt weather, frog fishing, flipping, punching. We're not quite there yet here. A lot of you guys up north are still fishing in huts on solid lakes, so hopefully that will start to get starting to frosting for you guys and get you guys start thinking about the springtime. But now this is my, ever since I've been a little kid, as soon as it was time to cut the grass, I was thinking about spring sports, right? Baseball and bass fishing. And hopefully you guys are like me, where you've been kind of cooped up all winter and you're really starting to think about that warmer weather and just bass fishing and piercing a few lips of those spring bass coming shallow, starting to think about their spawn in that pre-spawn movement. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the different types of fisheries and some of my favorite ways to catch them, my favorite ways to kind of find the fish, kind of the pattern that I run when I'm looking for fish. But now, like I said, I cannot emphasize it enough, it is go time as far as bass fishing. A lot of your tournament circuits have kicked off now. I know they had a couple, I think they got one going on right now. They had one last week down in Florida. So it's bass fishing time. It's always bass fishing time, but now it is warm weather, happy thoughts bass fishing time, if you guys know what I mean. But let's talk about the different types of fisheries, kind of roll through those real quickly. Those you guys that have followed the channel for a while, you probably have a good handle on the types of fisheries that you've been fishing, whether it's a Highland reservoir, a Lowland reservoir, kind of a featureless lake like a natural lake, or a river system or a delta system, something like that. All the different categories we're going to cover today and give you some baits and some things to think about the next time you take the boat out on the lake. Or if you're a shore fisherman, maybe the next time you go out and you hoof it, walk around the bank, and you're trying to catch a big bass. With that said, now is, in my opinion, the best time of the entire year to try and break your personal best, your PB bass, the biggest bass you've ever caught. These fish, when they're in pre-spawn mode, they are looking to feed up, their guts are big, and it's right before their spawn. So those big females are full of eggs. Now is the time to get excited about catching your new PB. So let's talk about the fisheries real quick, and we'll cover some baits. Got a couple different baits I want to talk about this year as opposed to last year. You guys know that we do these seasonal transition videos basically every quarter as we go through the different transitions for every year to help you guys either find fish or transition with the fish, stay on the fish you've been catching in the previous season. Let's go. So let's talk about Highland reservoirs real quickly. A Highland reservoir, for you guys that don't know, is a reservoir. Typically it's going to have long river arms that feed into the main body. Typically you're going to have long tapering main lake points. You're going to have long secondary points. As you transition from the main lake and go back into some of these arms, you kind of find your way into the backs of these bays. There's going to be secondary points. There might even be some high spots or island tops where these fish are going to kind of transition. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but let's talk about the type of fishery. So Highland reservoir, typically you're going to have steeper banks. For the most part, these fisheries The water level fluctuates a ton depending on summertime, the time of year, wintertime, and you're going to have real steep, narrow river arms, bluff walls. So that is a Highland reservoir. Lowland reservoir, you're going to have kind of a big kind of bowl main lake part of the lake. You're not going to have real long arms, river arms. You're going to have more depressions and high spots out on the main body. Island tops, you're going to have some creek channels that might head into some arms, but you're not going to have those real drastic, real long arms. Sometimes they can be 15, 20, 30, 50 miles long, those river arms, real long river arms. Lowland reservoirs, you're typically not going to have those, and they're not going to be as tapered, if that makes sense. You're going to have some high spots, you're going to have some low spots, you're going to have some island tops, you're going to have maybe some road beds or some creek channels, and those are all the features that these fish are going to use when they're transitioning from their winter kind of haunts where they've been all winter and where you've been catching them, as they make their way back into their spawning bays. So we talked about a Highland, we talked about Lowland, and now let's talk about your river system, or your kind of your deltas. TVA, Chickamauga, it's all current driven. Main lake is a river. A lot of times this time of the year, you're gonna have a lot of current as these storms come in. You get these early spring storms, dump a ton of rain. You can see out here, this lake's down about 6 or 7 feet. They crash it just in case of big storms, floods purposes. So you have your winter pool. Well, as we start getting into spring, a lot of these fisheries, the management, they're gonna start raising that water level. So river systems, those fish, a lot more movement out there on the main body. Most of the fish right now are stacked up out there on that main lip of your backwaters, out on the main river channel. So those fish are just stacked up out there, waiting for that warm water to come in, waiting for that water to rise, and then they'll pop up and make their way back to some of these arms. So we talked about that. Let's talk about your natural lakes. Your lakes that don't really have a very big or a dam at all. Typically, you're looking for any type of feature that's different than the rest of the area that you're fishing. Typically these are more featureless lakes. They don't have a lot of rock piles or points with breaks or stuff like that. You're looking for those little different pieces of cover or structure that those fish can kind of go to as they use those pieces of different cover or structure, as they use those along their process to eventually get back into those spawning bays. So typically your natural lakes, like I said, are kind of featureless. There's not a lot going on. Some have standing timber, some don't. Depends on the different parts of the country you're in. A lot of those lakes in Florida, you're fishing it almost all looks the same. It's all different types of grass, just kind of featureless, right? So now that you have a good idea of what types of fisheries there are, let's talk about the process, the transition that these fish are going to be making through the different types of fisheries. And I'm going to start off again with that Highland reservoir, because a lot of times this time of the year, this is the time where, like I said, it's the time to catch your personal best, the biggest fish of your life. The pre-spawn, as these fish are feeding up, thinking about getting ready for that spawn. They're moving. So this can be, if you're kind of stuck in your ways, your winter patterns, this is the time of the year where those fish can really ghost you, and you literally could be fishing in a fishless area of your lake. Yes, you might have been catching them there a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, maybe even just a few days ago. But if you get a string of a few warm days in a row, man, that light switch goes off in their mind, and these fish are thinking about pre-spawn and spawn. So let me emphasize that. Yes, it's the best time of the year to catch a giant fish, but it can be also a time, if you don't move with these fish, or find them quick enough, you could be fishing a whole backwater or an area where there might not be any fish. So, Highland reservoirs, they're gonna start out there on the main lake points. You probably have been catching them all winter, slow fishing with a jig or finesse presentation. Maybe you're deep cranking them. Maybe you're throwing an A-rig or something like that. But now that these fish are transitioning, it's time to cover water and start at that main lake point. They're gonna move right up to that point, and then they're gonna go to the next secondary point, and the next secondary point. And their goal by the end of this transition is to get in the back of these spawning bays. These big bays, or, I mean, they don't have to be big, but they're bays. They're not as steep or abrupt like some of the main lake stuff or some of the river walls, the bluff walls in the river channel. They're looking for more stable water, more stable weather, but they're gonna be working their way back, okay? I like to think of it, I talked about this in last year's video, I like to think of it as like a step process, almost like a ladder. This point, to this point, to this point, to this point, to the bay, right? Main lake point, secondary point, and they're gonna keep traveling until they get there. You can find these fish right along that pattern. If you start at the main lake point and there's nothing, go to that next secondary point. Nothing, next secondary point. Eventually, you're gonna find the bait fish and you're gonna find the bass along that transition. Now, if you find yourself catching less than average size fish, say you're catching, I don't know, a good bag, a good 5 fish average in your lake is 15 pounds, so a 3-pound average, and you're catching less than that. You're catching 1-pounders, 12 inchers, whatever it may be. Backtrack 1 or 2 of those secondary points, because that's where the big females are gonna be staged. They're usually a little bit behind those males as they start this process, okay? One other key thing to think about, there's lots of stuff to think about during this transition. Hopefully this will simplify it for you. But understand that, say these fish start this process. They got a week worth of great, gorgeous weather. It's warm. You got kind of a warming trend going. And they start this process. They hit that main lake point. They're secondary. So they're on the second or third secondary point on their transition to the back. And then you get a week of like a cold snap. A big storm comes in, cold front, something. These fish are going to lock down, but they don't really backtrack that process. So you're gonna have to switch up your techniques to catch them. We're gonna talk about that towards the end, the different types of baits and stuff. But they don't really ever backtrack in that process. So as long as you're willing to stay on that trolling motor, stay on the big motor, doing some side imaging, looking for the fish that are schooled up on those secondary points, you can find these fish and you can stay with them because you know where they're going. You know where they need to eventually get to, right? So now is the time to be moving until you find those fish. One other key thing that usually I run into this time of the year is when you get that storm that comes in during the middle of that warming trend. So they've started this process. They've left their winter areas that they were wintering in. They've started this migration route, whatever you want to call it. And then you get a couple days of rain. That fresh, typically warmer water coming in to those creeks, to the backs of the bays. Usually you have little creek arms that fill those bays and head out to the main lake. Those fish are they're going to just shoot to the back. I don't know why I keep looking down here. I guess this is my step process. But they're going to skip steps 2, 3, and 4, and they are going on the move. They're gonna blow through those areas and get to that fresh water. And I have some baits I want you guys to try when you find them there. So with that said, sandhill cranes are going crazy. With that said, that is the process. Now, a lowland reservoir, you're not gonna have as many, if any, secondary points, right? You're gonna be out there on that main lake. You might have a depression where the fish are kind of congregated in, and then you might have like a little creek channel that starts kind of heading back to a spawning bay, or maybe you have a little channel to an island top or a hump. You know, these fish are going to use those little deeper areas as a roadway, as a path to get back to those big spawning bays. I keep saying big. Those spawning bays. Yes, they can be big, they could be vast, or they could be somewhat small. But that's the main difference between the Highland and the Lowland reservoirs. And again, the river systems, those fish are out there on that main river. As soon as that water comes up, as soon as you get that rain, these fish are going to be heading right to the backs of these creeks, and they're going to be looking to feed. So, you know, ponds and natural lakes, kind of put those together. Again, we talked about natural lakes, kind of those semi-featureless lakes. Look for those same little depressions, maybe the old shoreline, maybe if you've had a drought or something where the water's been down and the waves have created a new kind of a shoreline. Look for those little deeper areas. And then look for stumps, look for brush piles, look for tires, anything like that along the way that you see on your side imaging, if you're using your electronics, or you see with your eyes, maybe you're in clear water. You know, waypoint that stuff, because as these fish come through, they're gonna stop on the key pieces of structure. They're gonna look for rock, right? So if there is say you have your main lake point, and you have your first secondary point, and then your second secondary point, and that secondary point has a good, nice rock pile on it, that's where those fish are gonna stay, kind of congregate to, wait for that weather to stable, and then go to, you know, step 3 and 4 and so on. So what's cool about this process, a lot of times once you find those fish during this process, after the spawn, so post spawn, some of those fish that are going to come back out to that main lake point, they're going to come out to those key pieces that you found during this transition, and you can catch them on the way out as well. Now, hopefully you guys have done your homework. Hopefully you've got out with the low water conditions and visibly seen what docks have structure or cover underneath them. You know, what docks are holding rock piles, or maybe brush piles, or whatever it may be. Or maybe it's a secondary point, like this point out here. That separates 2 of these arms going back to creek channels. Maybe there's a brush pile on there that you can waypoint. You know, do some research now while you still have low water, and be thinking about this as that water rises, and those fish are gonna be using that stuff to sit on as they make this transition. Talked about the different types of fisheries. Talked about what happens if you get hit with a storm during this process. Now let's talk about the baits. This time of the year, it is really, really important to cover water. Hopefully you have a good mapping system with your electronics, maybe a Navionics chip or a LakeMaster Plus chip, and you've done some research, but you know where these fish are trying to end up, and you know where they were, where you were catching them in winter, and you just got to find them somewhere in between and then stay with them during that process. And the best way to do that is some kind of moving bait. You're not going to want to sit there and drag a jig for half the day on that main lake point or that first secondary point, right? You're going to want to, got some baits for you. You're going to want to cover water. And this is what's cool about this time of the year. Wintertime, you're kind of slow fishing, right? You're throwing that jig, you're dragging that jig, you're throwing that worm, that shaky head, that drop shot, whatever it may be. And these techniques still work during this transition, but it's going to be your last resort. It's going to be the baits you throw when those storms come in, the cold fronts come in and they shut down, and you need to fish that rock pile. That's when you're going to transition to the more finessey baits, the slower moving baits. But this time of the year, start off with fast covering water baits. baits that you can cover a lot of water with, make long casts, and really try and find those fish. So a deep crank, some kind of cold water crank. You guys know how much we love that guy right there. If your tournament series allows it, or if your fun fishing allows it, an A-rig is probably, hands down, it's my favorite way to find fish and catch fish this time of the year. If you're a guy that likes to throw the bigger baits, the swim baits, glide baits, either your 5, 6, 7, 8-inch, 10-inch glide baits, you know, again, if you're a guy that wants to go out and catch your new PB, that's where you're gonna really benefit from throwing the larger baits. You know, the 168 and then bigger, the 200, the Bait Sanity, the Explorer, maybe it's a Depths 250 or one of the bigger glide baits, swim baits, the burritos, the mag drafts. All this stuff comes into play this time of the year. If you have colder water, go with your, you know, Matt just did an awesome in-depth swim bait video, but go with your swim baits that have a wedge tail instead of, like, this is a boot tail, right? This is gonna have a lot more kick. So as that water warms up, or if you're up there in that warm incoming water, that rainstorm and that current, you know, you can get away with that. But go with a swim bait that has that wedge tail tails, and you guys will have kind of that real natural looking kick in that colder water. But fast moving baits, so your crankbaits, either the Tactical DD, obviously, the Mega Bass, the Deep 6, the Deep X300. If your fish are shallow, out here on the TVA, these fish get super shallow, they stay super shallow. You could go with a square bill. You don't have to go, there's no right or wrong answer to this process or these questions, right? You try everything. Try your favorite confidence baits, the A-rig, the crankbait, deep crank, shallow crank, depending on the fish, the water level, and what you're seeing, right? The bait fish, if you're using your electronics, are the bait fish, are they in 2 to 4 foot, or are they in 20 to 30 feet, right? That's totally gonna dictate the different baits you're using. If they're deeper, go with the 8-rig. If they're, you know, go with an underspin, some kind of underspin, okay? But throw reaction baits, because you want to, if typically this time of the year, if I stop on a point that looks good, I've done some side imaging, I've done my research, I know there's a rock pile here and maybe there's some standing timber there, and I make 12 to 15 casts and I'm not seeing anything, I'm on to the next secondary point, right? I'm going through that process. I'm just checking off those points until I come across the fish, the bait fish and the fish. So moving quickly, A-rig, crankbait, swim bait, glide bait, other one, a chatterbait. If you guys can see this chatterbait I have tied on. This is the Cross Eyes chatterbait by Z-Man, not the jackhammer. This is a little bit different than what I talked about last year. You guys know how much I love the jackhammer, but this guy right here has a really stout, I mean, it's flexible, but you can adjust it, a weed guard. A lot of times this time of the year, as you get those late storms, you're fishing around or through debris that fresh water is bringing in. Having that weed guard on there allows me to fish a lot more effectively around wood. So if you have logs coming in, or you're fishing up shallow, maybe they've raised the water and now your shoreline is you know, a foot or two high, so now you're fishing in the cover, you're fishing in the brush. You know, having that extra weed guard on there has worked really, really well for me. And then also some kind of spinnerbait. I like white on white or white with chartreuse. I'll link all this stuff, guys, down below in the video description. But as that water's coming in and you go to the back, you know, you're fishing that moving water, throwing that spinnerbait up there in the brush, up there in the bushes, the chatterbait up there, those fish are gonna get their face, their nose right up in that current. As that fresh water's coming in, the lake level's rising up, they're up there and they're just waiting for that food to come to them, and that will get the job done. Can't tell you how many good fish I've caught on a spinnerbait or a chatterbait up there in that moving water. Again, you can throw an A-rig too, square bill, underspin, but don't be afraid to throw your quicker moving reaction baits. Again, it's all about covering water, finding where these fish are along that process, along that migration, or that route, whatever you want to call it. Some of these fish will go 50 yards, some will go 100 yards, 200 yards, a quarter mile. You gotta go through the different points along this transition to figure out where these fish are at. Some will move, big fish will move more than the little fish. You know, those big females, they have, like, wintertime, they have the spot, right? They have that spot on that main lake point or whatever it is, and then they gotta get here to that spawning bay. They're gonna make that trek. There's a big difference between normal size fish or smaller than average fish, and then your big ones, your PBs, your personal best, your double-digit bass. Those fish own that area. That's their area, and they're going to come back to it. So anyways, don't want to get off on too much of a tangent. If you are looking for baits to slow down and fish that key stuff with, I highly recommend a jig. A jig this time of the year is probably my favorite finesse bait. It still gets good big bites. If you do hook your next PB, say it's a double digit, you got that nice single hook in there, you get that thing hooked up in the roof of the mouth. It's a lot harder for those big fish to spit that single hook versus a treble hook bait, okay? So we talked about the transition. We talked about the different types of fisheries. We talked about if you're catching smaller than normal or smaller than average fish, backtrack along that process because that's where those females are going to be. Don't be afraid to get out right now, guys. This is the beginning of hopefully an awesome fishing season. That kind of pre-spawn, early spring, sun in your face, defrosting weather is awesome. I get super excited. It just means for a good year of fishing, and it just gets those fishing juices flowing. I like fishing in warm weather. I don't mind fishing when my hands are frozen and I can't feel my feet, but there's just something to be said about catching big pre-spawn bass and not having to really suffer through those crazy weather situations. So depending on where you are in the country, this info is going to apply to you somewhere in the next either couple days or month or so, depending on where you are. It could be a couple months if you're really up north. But take this information, apply it to your fishery. These baits are proven. We have a ton of confidence in them. Again, go through that checklist, those different steps along the way, run through the different baits that I talked about, and somewhere in there you're going to come across a school of fish, and then it's important for you guys to move with them. Run through the different types of baits, and you guys will have success as these fish move, transition. We'll do a couple videos here in the next week or so about actual favorite baits and all that stuff, but this stuff will get you started. Down below I'll link all the stuff, all the baits, the gear, the colors, all that good stuff. But here's to a good fishing season. Again, those tournaments are kicking off. It's kind of the, I guess, second week of really bass fishing. I've been fishing all year. Hopefully you have too, but as a whole, as an industry, it's kind of kicking off the last week or so, and it feels good to be back. Looking forward to the Classic here in our backyard up there in Knoxville, so hopefully get to see you guys there. But guys, I'm gonna quit rambling. Hopefully you can sense the excitement of springtime fishing, early spring fishing, and going out there and trying to catch the biggest bass in your life. Don't be stuck in your old ways. Don't be stuck on and fishing where you're catching them in the fall or the winter. You literally can be fishing in an area with no fish because they have moved along the way. I keep you guys get it. If you guys have any questions, please leave those down below in the comment section. We'll try to get those as soon as possible. Matt and I really appreciate you guys for watching. If you like this type of video, give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and we will see you guys on the next video.